Okay, we're ready to go. Would you say? Excellent. In that case, away we go. Welcome to the next question of series about functional extensions to Mojaloop for PI14. You probably remember me from the last session, but I would like to introduce Paul Makin, who will be my able co-presenter on this. So without further ado, I will hand it across to him and allow him to work his magic on you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So we're actually going to cover 4 areas today. I'm going to talk about some learnings from a national payment initiative. It was interesting in the previous session to hear Michael talking about 222 and some of the work that we've been doing in that area, and that all is related to this national payment initiative. I've been focusing on a couple of the use cases which are absolute priorities in this initiative, which are bulk payments and merchant payments using QR codes, and trying to establish a path through getting to an early launch of those services on the Mojaloop platform. Then Michael's going to talk about KYC compliance and currency conversion. So for the first half of this presentation, you'll have to put it with me before we return to Michael's dulcet tones. So let's look at this national payment initiative and bulk payments. So let's go straight on, if you wouldn't mind, Michael. So this particular payment system that we're talking about, there are 2 early delivery use cases that they want to do. They have P2P in place in an existing platform already. We are bringing Mojaloop to migrate that use case, and also, as well as 222 compliance, implement bulk payments for specifically government payments, and they're very interested in also making that capability available to NGOs and various other agencies. By bulk payments, I mean create a payments list of pay this person this amount and submit it into the hub for delivery. What we have to make sure is, if we're going to be delivering value, is that this has to be interoperable across all connected DFSPs. So it doesn't matter where you as an end customer, end beneficiary, choose to bank. We'll get the money to you. You could be a banked customer, a mobile wallet, a SACCO, an MFI, wherever it is, provided you're connected into the Mojaloop hub, clearly, because we're not using carrier pigeons, we can get the funds to you. And we can also, and this is an extremely important element of it, we can demonstrate that you receive the money, and also through collaboration with the end DFSPs, verify whether you actually received it with cash, as cash. An existing important element is that we have to support the existing business processes. We can't ask these various agencies that are connected into this service to adapt their business processes to what we want, to the way that we think this should work. So whereas we might, for example, like to deliver the money directly to a mobile wallet for somebody, in many cases there are local agencies who want to control that, control the disbursement in the last mile. So we have to be able to support that. Another important element is that they have their own internal beneficiary management systems. An example that some of you may be familiar with is OpenG2P. Beneficiary management systems manage the registration of beneficiaries, capture existing demographic information about them, their families, their employment, any aspect of their particular circumstances, and develop payment programs or beneficiary programs which set up a series of conditions on which payment might be made, and apply it to the beneficiary database to create a payments list. We're not doing any of that. We're just taking the payments list and doing that last mile element. So Michael, if you could move on. This is a simplified version of how bulk payments work currently in the Mojaloop world. If you look down the left-hand side, there are 5 participants here. There's the government or any other payment agency. There's the bank. There's the Mojaloop switch itself, the beneficiaries, DFSP, and the beneficiary themselves. And they all take part in this transaction. An important element on the left-hand side is you can see that the payer's bank has to carry out a series of actions when they've received the payments list from the government, where they actually have to reorder that list by DFSP. So we then have a set of sub-lists, effectively, payments per DFSP. And once that's complete and the fees have been identified, we can feed that back to the payer's bank and to the government to say, are you willing to accept these terms, essentially? And when they say yes to execute my bulk payment, we then go through a loop per payee DFSP, where we carry out a series of Mojaloop transactions to push the money from the payer's bank through to the payee at each DFSP in turn. And once that has been completed, first of all, looping through every DFSP and then looping through each individual payee, we can return the result of the bulk payment. And that's all well and good, and it makes perfect sense from the Mojaloop perspective. Michael, if you could move on. This is a simplified view of the Mojaloop ecosystem with all of the various DFSP types along the left and right of the hub, all connected into the hub. For bulk payments, if you can just click, please, Michael, there is an extra function that each of these DFSPs have to implement in order to reorder the payments list that they receive, in order to create an ordered payment list that the Mojaloop hub will accept. And this makes perfect sense from the perspective of the hub, because it provides clarity, it makes it nice and straightforward, and allows the hub to focus on the payments. But it does mean that we are decreasing efficiency. All of these DFSPs have to implement the same functionality. And it raises the barrier to entry for DFSPs. It's not how they're used to doing it. A DFSP is used to just creating a list, however it's ordered, taking that list from an employer or the government or an NGO and just throwing it at their payments provider. It's not their problem. So making them change their internal processes to carry out this additional step is just raising an unnecessary barrier to entry. So we're proposing to make a change to this. Michael, if you could click. So we're essentially taking the original process flow and moving that left-hand box entirely into the Mojaloop switch itself. So the payer's bank simply submits the entire bulk payment instruction to the Mojaloop switch, and that looping then to reorder the payments list happens within the switch itself. We're not taking away the ability of the payer's bank or the government or whoever it may be to agree to the terms of the transaction. We think that step is clearly very important, and we don't want to short circuit that. But once that's complete, once that acceptance has been agreed, then essentially it proceeds as before, looping again by receiving DFSP and looping by payee within that loop to carry out all the individual transfers. So from the government's point of view, there is no change. From the payer's bank, it's essentially a return to business as usual, as opposed to having to change processes for Mojaloop. And it's a relatively straightforward change for the switch itself. And it's business as usual again for the beneficiaries and their DFSPs. Thank you, Michael. If you can click on. The other thing I wanted to highlight was that we repeatedly get questions of identity raised whenever we're talking about bulk payments. So how do we make sure payments are going to the right person? And this is partially why I mentioned the beneficiary management system earlier on, because if we were able to implement that, we could actually include in that a verification of the beneficiary's details within that system during a registration and potentially during the initiation of a payment. But we're not able to do that. We have been exploring the potential link with digital identity services within this country, but we're some way off that. We're not going to be getting that in the initial versions of this. It may be that we need to come back and say, right, we've got it all live now, we've made these changes, but now how do we bring digital identity in? It's an important part of a bulk payment, particularly around social payments in particular. Ideally, we'd like to move to a pay me approach as opposed to pay my account. So I provide my identity, and that is linked to my DFSP and my DFSP account, and it gets routed to me directly. We've seen a number of countries where this has worked very well for bulk payments, particularly I'm thinking Nigeria, where they used digital identity for payments routing, and really managed to flush out an awful lot of ghost employees and beneficiaries across various social payment programs and the government itself. And it helps ensure, from my perspective as a beneficiary, that I get the payments, that there's no misrouting, there's no fraud going on, that the money actually reaches me. However, that's not this first phase, but I am hoping to be able to come back to you perhaps in the next phase and say, right, we really need to take this next step for the bulk payments. So that's more an on the horizon thing as opposed to next PI. So I think that summarizes everything I wanted to say about bulk payments for now. And now move on to merchant payments. And perhaps you can just go straight on, Michael, conscious of the time. QR codes. This National Payment Initiative is absolutely adamant that we have to go straight to QR payments. Other forms of merchant payment will be coming along in later phases, in particular PISP and merchant request to pay. But the reality on the ground at the moment is they really want to do QR. There's lots of different ways of doing QR. We've done a lot of work within Motorspot over the last 18 months on QR codes, payments, and how it might be linked into the Mojaloop hub. We've done a lot of design work for it, but we haven't actually been able to get anyone to pay us to implement it yet. So there's lots of different types of QR code. It's not all equal. There's merchant presented versus customer presented, which is really a question of who initiates a payment. So if it's merchant presented, it's essentially a push from a customer to a merchant. If it's customer presented, then it's a merchant requesting a payment from a customer. There's static versus dynamic. So a static code just identifies the merchant. It doesn't identify anything else about the transaction. So you have to actually enter the transaction details, the value, etc. And you have to check that the merchant is the right name. If it's dynamic, then you can put all sorts of extra information in the QR code around the routing of the transaction, the value, a range of other things. Crypto signing of the code should also be considered. There's plenty of space in a QR code to put a signature in there as a crypto signature in there. You don't see it done very often, but I would feel happier if I was able to verify that the QR code that's in front of me is the real one, was issued by the scheme and hasn't been faked by anyone else. That would allow us to do a lot more almost offline, in many cases, offline verification of transactions before the transaction is initiated, as opposed to doing it online. However, in the light of where we are in this particular national payment initiative, we're not able to do that. There are already existing processes. We also have to consider cross-border. And by that, I don't mean remittances. I mean a tourist or a business visitor in country who is used to using QR code payments. It's enabled by the home DFSP, and they just want to scan a QR code in this country and make the payment. So that you can view that as an export effectively. And we have to be able to remit the funds from one country to another to satisfy that. We need an international partnership there. And we need payments made from a pre-funded liquidity at a DFSP connected to the hub. Everybody wants this. Everybody wants the international visitors to be able to use QR codes as well. International settlement is obviously something that comes later. We can deal with that through a range of mechanisms. And in fact, I'm sure Michael will be talking about some relevant developments later. I see Lewis has made a comment that EMVCO is the standard for payments. I completely agree. It's a great standard, but you can do an awful lot with standards, which is effectively non-standard. So we need to be careful about the application of that. The EMVCO QR standard is rapidly becoming the de facto standard, I think, for pretty much every country that we're working in. I would just say that just because it's EMVCO doesn't mean it has to have anything to do with either E, N, or V. We can use that standard and adapt it to the circumstances of our particular national payment initiative.
Yeah, Paul, we need to talk more about that, because I think it's one of these tensions where Visa and MasterCard have basically pummeled everybody into compliance with their standard, which unfortunately is not interoperable, and it does not support the kinds of use cases that we actually care about. And so they have to get shoehorned in, basically crammed in as made up credentials that kind of look like track data in order to work. That's okay. We can find a way to make that work. I wouldn't have said that we shouldn't recommend that to anyone, but we can say there's a way to do it as long as our requirements can be met. There was a report that we had Glenbrook produce as part of the level 1 project. I want to make everyone aware of it. I can't find it. For some reason, our site is reorganized and the material is now missing, but it goes into some depth on the difference between static and dynamic, what some of the formatting issues are, the difference between EMVCO and some of the better standards, such as the one that is being used by Alipay. Where you mix a different kind of forms. And I think those are things that we should study carefully so that we can say, here is a practice that will meet you where you are if you're using EMVCO, but here's a practice where it could actually be superior and not incompatible with those other uses.
I mean, EMVCO will always define standards which are effectively grounded in card payments.
Clearly,
it's just I've spent a lot of time over the last 20 years working with different EMVCO standards and bending them to my needs. Often you find that one of the advantages of those standards is not that they're particularly good in any way. It's just that everybody knows them.
No, exactly right. Exactly right. I think that's exactly right. That if you find that that is simply the direction it's going, not unlike ISO 20022, then you have to find a way to make it work. And what I've discovered in working with a lot of the EMVCO standards myself is that they are so purpose designed in some cases as to be very difficult to apply. But in this case, actually, there appears to be ways forward that allow for these push payment systems to represent themselves credentially in the in the code stack. So yeah, you can have a MasterCard right next to your your push payment system, and the QR code can then work. That there are some operational reasons why we would want people to be open-eyed about adopting that in a market, but that's a separate question.
Yeah, absolutely. Miller, I completely agree. It's just that I would just take the pragmatic view that it's out there. There's, if you're talking to banks, they feel far more comfortable if they know it's an EMVCO standard, and they've probably been playing around with it internally in their own test suites. So if you've got that in place already, why not leverage it?
That's true from a bank perspective. I think we have to
Yeah.
remember that oftentimes the banking community says, oh, we've already done that. You all should do it our way. And what we've discovered is that usually doesn't map very well to the newer use cases. And so given that real time is emerging and banks aren't very good at that anyway, and yet mobile money operators are, we find that there's a more balanced ecosystem view, perhaps, that will emerge. What we don't, of course, want is to have 5 different QR codes at the point of sale.
Absolutely
that would be failure.
Not. Yeah. that would be a complete failure, and that's the situation that we're seeing. So if we can define something which is allowing us to do the interoperability, and I believe we have, then I don't see an issue with that. The last thing that we want anywhere here is multiple QR codes on the merchant's tables, on the merchant's till. There's one QR code, it's the interoperable one. And I really don't see that we need worry too much about it. It's just define the standard and use it. And given that if we're doing static, it has to be a push payment. There is minimal information that needs to be in that QR code, and we can readily support those static QR codes to make sure that we get around all the issues of fraud and duplication of QR codes, which I'll be coming to in a minute, in fact. But it's clearly not a done deal, and we need to think further about it. Okay, so Michael, if you can move on. Okay, so for a QR payment, these are some of the architectural elements. The blue boxes are essentially what we have already, more or less, and we're talking really a smartphone environment for QR codes, as you'd expect. There are 3 elements here that we don't really have, which need to be developed for a fully fledged QR code ecosystem. So there's the QR code processor, which takes some of the details around QR codes from the partnership, from the participating DFSPs, and verifies them. There's a QR code repository, which generates the static QR codes and can deliver them to merchants on demand. And there's a merchant registry, and this is an important element. We need to do live verification that merchants haven't been effectively shut down by the regulators. So we need to know the company registration details, and we need to use that information in the development of the QR codes. So we need to be able to develop something analogous to the EMV world's merchant IDs. So we need to be able to present in the QR code a merchant ID, not a DFSP account details. So this again comes around to aliases and paying a merchant ID, not paying into a merchant account. And partially that's to avoid, to force the customer DFSP to go to the QR code processor to route the transaction to that merchant, that particular merchant, and separately then so that we can verify whether the merchant registration is still okay, to see whether perhaps the authorities have closed that merchant down or not. So effectively, we're trying to put in controls straight away to avoid fraud and money laundering. Moving on, Michael. So we're going to try to take an evolutionary approach. We're not going to do that whole ecosystem in one. So for Milestone Zero, we're going to try to do something fairly straightforward. So it's a merchant presented static QR code. We're going to carry out simple merchant registry for a small number of merchants, and they're going to be manually registered in an Oracle. And that's, we will not be, in this case, carrying out merchant vetting. This is the proof of concept, effectively, in a live environment using, what's the phrase? Real rails, fake money in people's test environments. Or real money if you go by Michael's definition. So the use case is to see an MMO customer, a mobile wallet customer, scanning a QR code. They validate the merchant name, which is retrieved from that QR code. You enter the value of the transaction and authenticate yourself. Your app then pushes a payment through to your DFSP. The DFSP then carries out the verification of the merchant ID, check that it is still real, extract the destination account details, push the payment through the Mojaloop hub. The merchant receives the notification and releases the goods. Interoperable QR payments from a mobile money operator to a bank. That's not bad for a first shot in this national payment initiative. And I'd focus first on that first word, interoperable. So we're paying it from a mobile wallet directly through to a bank account, and the merchant gets notification that they've received the money before the customer leaves the shop. So that's milestone 0. Milestone 1 will be moving to more sophisticated verification of the merchant registry. And I've just realized that somehow in the translation into your laptop, we appear to have gone to an unusual font, which I won't worry about. So essentially, this is, Michael, this is just a process flow for the process I've just described.
Yeah, I can see it. It's just Klingon. You just have to read Klingon native.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I assumed it was part of your international sophistication, Paul, so I was much too embarrassed to say anything about it.
Yep.
In case you sneered.
Admit it, Michael, you did not look at this slide before.
I did look at it. Referee. I looked at it. I thought, blimey, that's a sophisticated font.
Okay, so anyway, everybody will have to take my word for it. This is a process flow for QR code payments that we are currently going through the process of implementing for this national payment initiative. The elements of this are the customer at the top. The mobile money operator is in yellow. We have the payment manager in there, interfacing to the mobile money operator. We have a merchant and the merchant's mobile banking app and bank, and another instance of payment manager. And all of these, both of these payment managers interact with the Mojaloop hub. And the oracle at the bottom interfaces with the merchant registry, which is what all that lovely text says, I promise. And that's all I want to say on that for the moment. Thank you. So I'll pass over to you, Michael.
It said surrender now. Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Paul. I am going to start with 2 apologies. First of all, to Paul, because I'm not going to talk about cross-border settlement at all. And second, to Caridia Nyangado and Pierre Combel, both of whom contributed extremely to these second 2 presentations. I'd hope to thank them personally, but I noticed that neither of them is currently on the call. So you will have to take my thanks to you instead of them. Okay, so we have 2 things that we want to talk about here. The first is the matter of KYC compliance for non-national schemes. Now, when we think about Mojaloop, we very often think about national schemes run by central banks or governments or similar sorts of people. But as we know from the Mawali case, that's not always the case. And in some cases, Mojaloop schemes can be run independently by groups of people who want to support it. And in that case, we assume that those non-national schemes will be regulated like a DFSP. They will have to meet the same sorts of standards as a DFSP would to convince a regulator that they are operating correctly and that they are not supporting the transfer of funds where they should not. However, unlike a DFSP, they don't have independent access to KYC information. So we assume that therefore, a non-national scheme needs to have access to the same KYC information for DFSP customers who participate in transfers using it, as the DFSP will be required to provide for customers who participate in the DFSP's own on-us transfers. And also we assume that that has to be information which is current at the time of transfer. That is, it won't be sufficient to pick up the information later on if the regulator says, oh, by the way, what happened about this transfer? Why did you allow it? Second, we assume that KYC information will therefore have to be collected from the DFSPs who already own it, and that the regulator will need to allow the non-national scheme to rely on the KYC compliance of its DFSP participants. In particular, there doesn't seem to be any obvious way that a Mojaloop scheme can have independent KYC knowledge about the customers of the participants in that scheme. So that's an assumption. Now, what kind of information do we need to collect? Well, typically it might be first name, last name, date of birth, phone number, address, occupation, and at a per transfer level, the reason for transfer and the relation with the other party. When we look at where we currently are on that, we currently provide or can provide first name, last name, and date of birth. Phone number, we can provide it accidentally in some cases because it's a standard identifier and it's one that's frequently used, for instance, by mobile money schemes. But it's not the only identifier that could be used, as Paul's been saying. A payment might be identified by merchant number or alias. So we need some way that always provides a phone number, no matter what identifier type was used to make the request. And the last four, we don't currently have information about in any case. So what do we propose for the solution? Well, we already have a data object in the FSP IOP API, which is the party personal info, as I'm sure you will all be saying to yourselves already long before I mentioned it. We need to extend it, though, to include all of the required KYC information. Now, this data object is already returned for the payee as part of the discovery phase. It's from that object that the payer DFSP extracts the name of the payee so that it can do name discovery to its customer. But it's also included both for the payer and for the payee in the quote information. So the payer DFSP will get information about the payee's customer from the put party's response, and it can include information about its customer as part of the post quotes request. Now, we can enforce this content by scheme rules implemented in the switch and published in the scheme rules definition. And then all we need is for the switch to store that information about both parties in a compliance data store. And then a non-national scheme can query the contents of this data store as required to meet compliance requests. Now, we've had an outline discussion about this in the Change Control Board, extending the content of the party personal info object to include the optional data elements. In principle, the Change Control Board is in favour of this, but we need to agree on a list of the required elements as shown above, and we think that will then be able to go ahead. And because these are optional data elements, they won't be breaking changes. They won't, people who don't use those elements in schemes that are implemented now will be able to carry on as they do now. But the additional functionality will be available if required. And as I say, it can be enforced by individual schemes as part of their rules. So the payer DFSP will include information. So there won't be any further processing required from that DFSP. There is a question that says, are we required to hold KYC information related to all transfers or only successful ones? But there's no architectural difference to the solution there. And then the switch will store the information it receives about the parties in a data store. Now, we can arrange this by transfer. That says these are the actual parties who participated in this transfer. It's relatively expensive in terms of storage, but it's more reliable than any other message. And we can store it by content. So we can say this set of information was used to justify these transfers. The data store will obviously map this personal information to as many different identifiers as are used in transactions in which the customer participated. So we will also, using this, be building up a record of the different identifiers which are associated with a particular set of KYC information, which may be interesting and valuable information in itself. We assume, as I say, that a quote request where a party has KYC information that's already stored by the system is a request for the same party. If there is any reason to believe it isn't for that party, that must be a KYC error. And this will be true whatever identifier. So we're starting to build up, as I say, a persistent identity record about a particular set of KYC information. And as far as querying the data store goes, the store relating personal information to transfers can just be queried ad hoc. Subsequently, we can make standard queries available via the HOB operator portal. So the MVP characteristics would be it uses existing personal information, as we've already described it, and it stores information by transfer, so we don't have to bother adding relatively sophisticated stuff to store the KYC information once and associate it with a number of transfers. So the tasks are, we don't want any modifications in the DFSPs, except including the KYC information in the post quotes request. We store the information relating to the post quotes call, but then we store the quote anyway, so that's not too much of a problem. We can store it against the transaction ID, but again, that's part of the post quotes thing. So initially, this could simply be the content of the post quotes message. I have some information on extending the system to cover AML compliance, but given the time pressure that we're under, I will allow you to look that up in the presentation itself, of which there is a copy, of course, on the site. Should you want detailed information about that. So now I want to move on to the questions of what currency conversion API might look like. So I want to talk about use cases, about architecture, and about a proposed structure of an FX API. So what sort of conversion use cases do we need to think about? So first of all, there might be one where the DFSP performs their own currency conversion. And in that case, there's no FX in the system. The only requirement is that the DFSP must be able to provide liquidity cover in the target currency. So that's relatively simple. We don't really need to do anything to the system to support that. Then there's a case where a DFSP pre-purchases currency from an FXP as it requires it. That means that the DFSP must have liquidity credit with the switch for the amount of currency that it's already purchased. And effectively, this covers provided by the FXP, which has received the funds from the DFSP. In addition, the FXP may have deposited the converted funds with the settlement authority, because there are some cases, and Mawali is one of them, where some forms of currency conversion require the target funds already to be lodged with the central bank of the target currency. So in that case, the FXP will need to be credited with that amount of liquidity cover as well. And there should be a way of identifying funds of this type, unless we're happy for DFSPs to choose once and for all whether they're going to use this method or the following method, which is using payment versus payment to obtain conversion on the fly. And this is the standard FX case, where the debtor DFSP maintains liquidity source currency and with the FX provider, and the FXP maintains liquidity cover in the target currency and settles with the payee DFSP. So what are our objectives? First of all, I'll rephrase that. Yeah, what are our objectives possibly? First of all, to minimize the footprint of the foreign exchange provider. Second, to allow the currency conversion process to be managed either by the participant DFSPs or by the switch. Third, to make an FXP transfer single hop. And fourth, to make this a non-breaking change for the FSP IOP API. You can give me marks out of 10 for this. So currently, Mawali's implemented a 2-transaction model. This is problematic, to say the least. Previous design thinking has proposed a 2-transfer 1-transaction model with a question about how many condition fulfillment pairs should be required for that. In both cases, quote and transfer are routed via the FXP by directly addressing the first phase of the operation to it. And the FXP is a full participant in the transfer. It essentially functions as a DFSP from the point of view of the resources it supports. Currency conversion is managed through an extension of the existing FSP API, and requests, worryingly, are made prior to the final terms of the transfer being known, i.e. on the post-quotes request. So you will doubtless remember that when I issue a request for quotation in the Mojaloop system, that's not necessarily the final amount that the participant will be required to send, and therefore that will be required for conversion. So we've had to think several times about different ways around that to make sure that we can get everything properly converted. And as an alternative, we might say, well, currency conversion is really a matter between a DFSP and an FXP. Transfer terms should record the content of that agreement, but there's no need for the switch to route the quote or the transfer through the FXP. And the FXP should sign the terms under which it performs the conversion, so that it can confirm to other participants that it has separately assented to its part in the transfer and has cleared the funds appropriately. So in agreement, in the agreement phase, the quotation phase, the debtor DFSP can specify which FXP it wants to use, and either the send amount or the receive amount. The debtor DFSP then sends directly to the creditor, to the payee. The creditor DFSP works out the final terms of the transfer and then asks the FXP to make a binding agreement on converting the currency amount, which is now fixed. The FXP sets, so it asks the FXP directly. The FXP sets the terms for conversion, signs them, and returns the condition to the creditor. The creditor incorporates those terms, including the condition, into the terms, signs all of the terms, and returns them to the debtor DFSP. So the conversion signed by the FXP, the overall terms are signed by the debtor DFSP, and both conditions are available to the other parties in the transfer, i.e. the switch and the debtor, the debtor DFSP. That should say creditor DFSP, sorry. Now for the transfer, the debtor DFSP sends direct to the creditor. The switch can do liquidity checks and funds reservations in both currencies. The creditor DFSP asks the FXP to confirm its transfer, and the FXP returns its fulfillment, which can be checked by the creditor DFSP. So the creditor DFSP should be able to be confident that the FXP has unalterably committed to making the transfer. Creditor DFSP then returns both fulfillments to the debtor DFSP. The switch checks them both, commits the funds in a single pass, and confirmation can be sent if required. So how would this work? The existing model for agreement is it goes to the FXP, goes to the creditor DFSP, back again to the FXP, and back again to the debtor DFSP. So for transfers, things get a bit more complicated. First of all, transfer request goes to the switch and funds are reserved against the debtor DFSP. Then it goes to the FXP with a reservation request. The FXP responds and funds are reserved for FXP. Then it goes to the creditor DFSP for confirmation. Then it goes back to the switch with a confirmation response, back out to the FXP for a confirmation request, back again for a confirmation response, And finally, we go back to the definite DFSP. In the proposed model, well, it's not very different. In the agreement phase, except that it's the creditor DFSP who is talking to the FXP and not the switch. But things are, I think, simpler in terms of the transfer. Transfer request goes to the switch, funds are reserved. Goes to the DFSP. Sorry, when I say funds are reserved, I mean both the debtor DFSP's funds and the FXP's funds are reserved. It goes to the creditor DFSP, who asks the FXP directly to commit. The FXP responds to the creditor DFSP, and the creditor DFSP can now check that response and send both responses back to the switch. The switch can then commit both funds and send them back to the debtor DFSP. It can also be done by the switch itself. I'll go around that quickly because, again, we are short of time. Who controls the currency conversion process? Oh, 5-minute warning, sorry. First of all, it's designed to be controlled by DFSPs without using the switch, but it can be run by the switch, and I describe in a bit more detail how that might happen below. An API to do that has 4 endpoints. That's all that a DFSP, sorry, an FXP needs. Actually, an FXP only needs to support 3 of them. It needs to support purchase to allow bulk purchases, a conversions endpoint to ask for a commitment to a currency conversion, and a commitments endpoint. And I talk in a little bit more detail about what changes are required to the FSP IOP API, and you will notice that they are all optional and therefore non-breaking changes. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions?
I have one quickly, Michael. I won't. This can be for further discussion. It seems that you used a form that had the FXP reference to the creditor DFSP. I think there's another case, however, where the FXP relationship more naturally is with the debtor side, given that this is a push payment. That is, I wish to push money to someone in a foreign country. That's one thing that needs to be explored. There's an asymmetry there. We probably want to look at what are the 2 symmetric cases. Maybe we don't care about one of them. I suspect they both matter. In other cases, you've done this with a single switch, and the other is where there's a multiple switch case. That is, we have 2 markets, Kenya and Uganda, switch in both markets. We would like to do an inter-switch agreement between the 2 so that we don't have to do bilateralism between 2 countries with 700 banks on both sides. So we obviously don't want the banks talking to each other as so much as we would like to see a corridor agreement between the 2. I think those are maybe 2 completely separate areas that require a little bit more evaluation. But this is very good.
Well, the second one, I think,
what I've seen.
Thank you. The second one, I think, forms part of my apology to Paul that this deals with effectively with conversion within a single switch, as you say. And it does so because it came out of discussions with Mawali about how we could improve currency conversion in their case. To your first point, this situation allows the payer DFSP, the debtor DFSP, to specify which currency converter or which FXP should be used. But the point about it is that it's only at the point when the funds are set by the payee DFSP that the conversion can actually be agreed. And I thought it was important for the conversion terms themselves to be signed not only by the FXP, but also by the payee DFSP, the creditor DFSP. And that's
you're absolutely right. I think this briefly, I would say that the FXP is actually 2 entities, a legal entity in, for example, Uganda and a legal entity in Kenya. They happen to be controlled by the same organization, and they might talk to each other through tin cans and string, but they're actually 2 different entities, and they're both joined to different systems in those markets. And so while you could say, I want to use currency converter ACME, in your sending market, there is also a currency converter Acme relationship in the receiving market, and it's up to them to figure out how they talk to each other. But they're both responsible for liquidity cover in their own markets. That is, FXP Acme in the sending market will be paid, and FXP Acme in the receiving market will have to pay out to the other. And you would want to be sure that the agreement that's being signed by the payee side represents that it's immediately paid out. Adrian can tell you more about our concerns there, that someone says, oh yeah, no, I'm good for this. I printed a voucher. I'll make sure he gets it next week, Friday. We want to be sure the payment actually occurs while that messages are in flight in order to meet the level 1 project principles for this kind of thing. Anyway, I know we're out of time. I don't want to take up your time now, but there's more here. This is excellent though. Thank you for going into so much detail with it.
Okay, and thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Paul. So I'm going to close out the day with just a couple of thoughts. First, I'm delighted to see more emphasis on deployments and customer and potential customer requirements in all the presentations here today. A lot of reference there has been very useful. Also want to note the teamwork and collaboration across topics and teams has been really exceptional, and I appreciate you guys putting in that hard work in advance of this week's activities. Third, you know, there's a lot of good ideas here, but of course we need resources. So it's great that everyone's here on the call this week participating, but we also tomorrow will really ask you to commit and identify those resources that you can bring to these various projects. We have a rapid pace tomorrow. We've got to go through the product roadmap, do some work stream voting and breakout sessions, and then get report outs on some of those key sessions at the end of the day. So going to be an intense but very productive day, I'm sure, tomorrow. And then finally, don't forget, we like to have a screenie for posterity. We want to take a photo of all the participants. So wear your best or funnest shirt, and we'll be sure to pose by the end of the day to record your participation in this event. So with that, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again tomorrow morning. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.